Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I didn't print this in big enough print, so I have no idea who your speaker is today. We are seeing him being mic'd right now. I am introducing with great pride and esteem James E. Tierney, who has, and you will find it today, an unwavering dedication to justice and is a figure of respect and admiration in the legal community. Now, what you have to remember is he was my first real boss, and he's looming over there on the side. So wouldn't you say he's handsome and brilliant while we're at it? You have his full bio in the invitation, and I'm not going to repeat it verbatim, but I'll tell you this. Jim Tierney's impressive career is a testament to his commitment both to public service and legal education. It is also a testament to a Maine law education. His Maine law class of 74, just celebrated its 50th anniversary reunion here this summer. So looking back at a storied career, Jim's experience has been absolutely extraordinary, and his unflagging energy for the pursuit of real justice is a marvel to all of his friends. Serving first in the Maine legislature and then for a decade as Attorney General of Maine, he skillfully navigated the complexities of state law, earning a reputation for integrity and exceptional legal insight. His leadership in Maine's legal landscape left a lasting impact on both policy and practice. There is very little in the state of Maine in the past 50 years that Jim Tierney is not familiar with. He knows where all the bodies are buried. Currently, Professor Tierney is a faculty member at Harvard Law School, and his advice is sought by attorneys general throughout the country. It's also possible that his advice is occasionally sought by one or two law school deans on a regular basis. I want to give him lots of time to speak, so I'm going to wrap up fast. Some of you have heard me tell the story of Jim listening to me yammer on as a new AAG, describing a complex set of interlacing legal issues and asking for his advice. And he had so often told new AAGs, you're in the AG's office now, your job is to do justice. So he looked at me when I got done yammering. I like to think it was a brilliant exposition, but looking back, it might not have been as brilliant as I remembered. He looked at me actually quite patiently, and then he said, okay, softly, what's the right thing to do? So I will tell you that whenever I get lost in the currents of law and regulation, I remember to step back and think of that question. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to the one and only James E. Tierney.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a thrill to be here. It's Constitution Day. We're going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So I look forward to it. I really am here in my capacity as an alum of this school, a school that gave me a chance, a working class kid like me. My parents were high school dropouts. I didn't have a dime. I was married, had a couple kids, a foster child, and it was the University of Maine, instead of the fancy schools that I got into, that I came, and I've never regretted it. So I owe a great debt to the school, a debt that at this point in your career, it must be very hard to see, right? But there will come a time, and I always hope you remember and keep this school close to you. We're going to talk about the Constitution. And I am not a historian, I'm not a scholar, not remotely. And yet I have developed in preparation for these remarks done kind of an extraordinary amount of research, and I've learned a great deal from doing it that I hope I'm able to impart not just to you today, but to future students wherever I might go. We're going to talk about three things. First of all, where did the Constitution come from? How was it written? Secondly, we're going to talk about how did the Supreme Court become as twisted as it is today, and it's fundamentally dysfunctional. If you haven't read about it, just on Sunday there was an extraordinary story that broke that talked about the internal battles and dynamics and where justices, I mean, I've never seen anything like it, and I don't know how they went to work yesterday and sat in the same room together after the fact that they clearly were not trying to do the same thing. And this, not on any particular issue, but it was extraordinary. And then lastly, we're going to talk about what we're going to do about it, and I'll wrap it all up in about 25 minutes. No problem. All right, try to imagine if you can. It's a Friday evening, May 1787, and you were in the largest city in the United States, city of Philadelphia, had 40,000 people, substantially smaller than Portland is today. And 6 people were invited to go out for dinner to figure out what they were the first delegates to arrive for the Constitutional Convention. 2 of them were already famous. One of them was George Washington. In his mid-50s, he was a national hero when he arrived in Philadelphia. He arrived to great fanfare with a parade, and people came out to see him. The second was the host. The host was Benjamin Franklin. He was 81 years old, the same age that President Biden is today. And he was perhaps the most famous man in the world. People underestimate that fact. He was also one of the wealthiest, certainly the wealthiest person in the United States. And he was their host. And the third person who showed up was not as well known, but who plays a substantial role in the whole question of constitutional theory, and that was James Madison. And I started off this project of mine I hadn't thought a lot about him. Well, I've thought a lot about him now, and I am not a fan. So you should know right up front, I am not a James Madison fan. He was a political intellectual who loved flipping ideas back and forth. He didn't really, he was always talking about freedom, and he had plenty of time to do that because he had 113 slaves who were doing all the work on this plantation. So he had plenty of time to sit back and write and think big thoughts. He arrived, and the constitutional scholars, historians, all said he was very, very young. How old was that? He was 36 years old. I don't know. When I was 36, I'd already served 8 years in the legislature and then actually written a provision of the Maine Constitution. So I wasn't that impressed, But the big thing was he never served. Now, as you probably all know, Alexander Hamilton, future Broadway star, was at Valley Forge with George Washington during the entire Revolutionary War. It's a traumatic experience for him. He, of course, came from nothing. James Madison was constantly plagued with serious, undefined illnesses, which were never disclosed. So he couldn't really go to the Revolutionary War because of these undisguised illnesses. I think it might have been bone spurs. I mean, that's just my best guess, because these illnesses were so serious, he had them all the way up till the time he died at the age of 86. Right? So somehow Madison got through all of this. I think James Madison would fit right in with today's United States Supreme Court. I think he would fit like a glove. So I'm not a fan. So anyway, what did these 6 people decide? Now, try to think how small, first of all, 6 people. Right? It's just like right here. Right? And they came and they decided right up front that they were going to trash the Articles of Confederation. They weren't going to try to fix it. Very important. And the second thing they were going to do was try to put this in a document. They're going to write it down. Now, there are a lot of constitutions in the world that aren't written down. Why? Because certainly all of the colonies were common law. We were based on the common law. The common law isn't all written down. It's a compilation of many, many different decisions and experiences. And it was that culture within which they decided to operate. But they were going to write it down. They were going to turn it into a document. One of the reasons was that the literacy rate in the Northeast was 90%. White males, of course. That's all the only people who counted. But 90%. So they knew this had to be written down. It was unclear whether the Northeastern states were going to ratify this. So it was going to be a document. That was a big deal. Now, part of the problem is they left, their best wordsmiths weren't there. John Adams was in England with his wife and his family. Abigail Adams, obviously. They were in England, London, and Thomas Jefferson, who'd written the Declaration of Independence, he was in Paris. he was not alone in Paris. I mean, he brought his kids over, but he couldn't deal with them, and he sent them over to Abigail Adams, who actually raised his kids. But he kept sending her letters about who he was dating. You know, he's a single guy. You know, it's in Paris. What can I say, right? So that was Jefferson. So they weren't there to help write this Constitution. The natural people who had that capacity and had been so fundamental to the revolution. So finally, the rest of the delegates show up. The maximum number was 55. The average attendance was 30. George Washington was always there. He presided every day. He didn't go anywhere. And these were men of the Enlightenment. They were all male. They'd read Locke and Hume, Diderot, Montesquieu, Adam Smith. And Franklin, in all the years he lived in London, was personally friends with Jeremy Bentham, Edmund Burke. He'd met with Voltaire. These were intellectual people. And so they came to this extraordinary experience to try to write this Constitution down from that perspective. But it was a common law perspective. It was a common law perspective. It was not like the European civil codes that you see in France. You have now in Louisiana. But as the summer progressed, these lofty ideas started to fall away. And the real practical politics emerged. It was pretty clear they weren't going to do anything about slavery. Anything about slavery, the southern states were going to walk. But they didn't talk about it that much. And they were very worried about the mob. They were worried that the Shays' Rebellion had terrified them. They were very afraid of democracy. They didn't like that so much. And of course, nobody wanted to pay taxes. They had to figure out if they were going to have a government, who was going to pay for it? They had all these debts, and the states had debts and loans left over from the Revolutionary War. So my point is that while they came from a high-level intellectual perspective of their times, they were also very, very, very practical. So everyone got together. They worked very hard. They worked 6 hours a day, and they worked late into the evening. And they wanted three things for sure. They wanted a government. They did not want a king. And they definitely did not want a state religion. So what came out of that process in September, right, of that year? We're celebrating Constitution Day today for a reason. One of the fundamental concepts was that they developed a document which was very hostile to what we today would call democracy. The United States Senate, not a democratic organization, not even elected by voters, elected by legislatures, 2 per state. Maine was a beneficiary, but clearly not democratic. The president, elected by some sort of electoral college. The only true elective body would be the House of Representatives, which would be a portion based on population. And aha, here the southern states put their foot down, and they said, well, of the 4.5 million people in the United States, 500,000 of them are enslaved. And we want to count them for apportionment purposes. But we also want to buy and sell them as if they were animals. There were abolitionists at the Constitutional Convention, so they had to settle. Who came up with the settlement? James Madison came up with the settlement. And his settlement was, well, we'll just count the slaves, which he had goodly number, as 3/5 of a human being. Imagine a human being. And we're going to count you as 3/5, which would give more congressmen to the South. But again, of course, we're not doing anything about the underlying slave trade. You can see why Madison wasn't, high on my list. Anyway, we came out with the United States of America. They had a lot of faith in states' rights. But then they had to ratify it. They had to get the Bill of Rights. And this shifted the ability to talk about this Constitution, which had not talked about religion. But again, James Madison said the finger of God was on this Constitution. It was part of the campaign to ratify. I have two thoughts. First of all, the thought that God could take the time off to do this. Get into all these nitty-gritty details. And secondly, if God had done it, would have done a much better job. All right. wouldn't have left so many things. But anyway, God. And the second thing, of course, was that the Federalists, the pro-Constitution people, they owned the mainstream media at the time, which were newspapers. They were all owned by the Federalists. So it was ratified. It was close, but they got it. But what the court did not do was the Constitutional Convention did not do was think through the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was created in the Constitution. The other federal courts were decided in the First Continental Congress. They didn't think it through. I don't even know, because there's no evidence, that it even occurred to them that the Supreme Court could invalidate something that Congress had passed and was signed by the president. Well, Marbury versus Madison came along, written by Chief Justice Marshall, who was Thomas Jefferson's first cousin. They couldn't stand each other, but he was his first cousin. He writes this decision saying that it's okay for the Supreme Court to toss out something that had been, even this anti-democratic House and Senate and President still managed to do some things, and the court said, no, we're not going to go there, we're not going to buy it. Unconstitutional. How do we know? Well, we know, actually, it was confidential at the Constitutional Convention, but one person took notes, and we could always go back and check those notes to find what was constitutional or not. Who was that person? James Madison. He took the notes of the Constitution. Kept changing them, too, to make himself look better, right up to the time he died. They've discovered this. They've gone back to look at his original notes of the Constitution, but with infrared stuff. Now, they actually have these papers, so they can go back and they see he was just tossing things out, putting things in. I saw he'd fit in this Supreme Court we have now very easily. He's like a perfect guy. But so the next time a law was struck down by the Supreme Court was in the Dred Scott decision, because slaves were running away and we had to return them because they were running away to the free states. We had to get them back because they were property. And in doing so, the Supreme Court, Justice Tierney, invalidated the entire Missouri Compromise of 1820. He went back 30 years. So it was very unusual. But the power was established. And pretty soon we've got Plessy v. Ferguson, and we've got Lochner, we've got Brown versus Board of Education, Bush v. Gore, we've got Dobbs, and we've got Trump versus the United States. So this power that the court took unto itself was something that the framers could not possibly have envisioned. That 5 people with life tenure could have this sort of authority, even in their most non-democratic ways. And the court understood that. McCulloch versus Maryland, if you haven't read that, you will. It's a seminal piece in which Chief Justice Marshall famously said, we must never forget it is a constitution we are expounding, intended to endure for ages and come, and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. 1819. My friends, the Constitution is not an end. The Constitution is a process. The Constitution will be what you make of it in your lifetimes. Because everyone said the Constitution could be changed later, the framers thought that, well, guess what? Later is right now. And you are the decision makers. And that may seem far away from you, but it's true. So what's this original? Where did originalism came from? Originalism came from, as you can imagine, a bunch of law professors with too much time on their hands. And they kept thinking, they didn't like this. They didn't like all this democracy stuff and all this government stuff. So they literally dreamed up a theory, maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago. More than that, I guess, probably 40. Most of them at the University of Chicago. And they dreamed up this idea that what if the Constitution only meant what they wrote down, right? And so all we have to do is get inside the heads of the framers, right? And then we'll know what to do today. So we've got 330 million people today. They had 4.5, but it's the same thing, right? All you have to do is be an originalist. Now, I ran into last year's speaker, Senator King, at the farmers market in Brunswick, and he insists that I quoted him. This is a sign of a politician who just needs to hear something he said written. So I'm going to quote him because it is actually brilliant. He's a good friend and he's a terrific U.S. Senator. And he and Professor Heather Cox Richard had an article in the Atlantic 3 years ago. And he just got right to the bottom line, much more than I was even prepared to do. This is Senator King. To put it bluntly, the whole premise of originalism is nonsense. Originalism is an intellectual cloak drummed up somewhat recently to dignify a profoundly regressive view of the Constitution. The real problem with the originalist theory is that it allows no room for ethical, moral, or political growth. If the framers didn't think it, it's not allowed. That's from Senator King. Now, there are many originalist theories, but another former speaker, Professor Richard Fallon, who's a colleague, who gave this remark in 2012, and I quote him because he's a graduate of Coney High School, where he played on the state high school basketball team. Very important. Professor Fallon gave this talk in 2012, and he said of originalism that it created a patina of political neutrality. I think that's much better than Senator King. A patina of political neutrality that allows judges to get political advantage to make political decisions behind a cloak of impartial historical research. He said that here in 2012. It was 12 years ago. 12 years ago, we did not have 6 originalists sitting on the United States Supreme Court. Today we do. Justice Brennan, 1985, he got to the bottom line too. More than I probably would have done, but he said it, so it's not me. He said originalism is arrogance cloaked in humility. It is arrogant to pretend that from our vantage point, this is Justice Brennan speaking, we can gauge accurately the intent of the framers. And that politicians that claim to do so are motivated purely by political reasons. Supreme Court Justice Brennan. So, as Fallon said, today everyone takes for granted that originalist theories invariably have conservative or libertarian implications. So if you think about it this way, if you today, really don't like all the fact that all these people are voting, you can't really get around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But if you're on the Supreme Court and you're an originalist, you can leap over the whole thing, back when only white men could vote. And you can leap over the whole thing and strike down the Voting Rights Act 5 years ago. You can pass Citizens United to allow corporations to give unlimited anonymous money to political campaigns. You can leap over the whole thing by using originalism. You can wipe out the administration, and you can do more than that. Anybody here care about climate change? We passed the Clean Water Act, sponsored by Senator Muskie from Maine. The Clean Air Act. They asked him why he moved out of Rumford. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings who may be from Rumford, but he moved out of Rumford to Waterville. They asked him why, and he said, because Rumford stinks. Can you imagine the U.S. Senator being that honest today? They said, Rumford stinks. And the reporters were horrified, and they said, how can you say something like that about your hometown? He said, you think the people of Rumford don't know that it stinks? Right? So he decided to do something about it, and he did. We passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. When I was in high school, raw sewage going into the Chicago River. I was in Brunswick. Paint peeling off houses. We did something about it collectively as a society. They were compromised. They were negotiated. Well, the Clean Water Act, after being upheld 7 times by the United States Supreme Court, struck down the wetlands decision, second, last year. Wetlands are nature's way of stopping flooding. It's the best thing you can do. And so Justice Alito said, it's actually worked pretty well, but it's time to change it. Congress didn't change it. He changed it. And the result of the decision left 50% of the wetlands in the United States beyond the scope of the Clean Water Act, which I can assure you is a major gift to developers who want to fill in the Scarborough Marsh. putting all that pressure on state government. Maine does a pretty good job with it. A lot of states don't count on it. And then we have a flood, and people say, look at the flood. How could this be happening? The water's in the streets. Water in the streets because you filled the wetlands. This isn't that complicated. Congress did not change that law. Justice Alito changed it. 5-4, there you go. I won't even get into church and state. We could get into guns. We could talk about the Second Amendment. It's the same idea, the same principle that courses through if you are an originalist on the court and you want to get back. So who are these people? I used to know some justices on the Supreme Court. I don't know any of these people. So who are they? Are they, as implied in the New York Times yesterday, Sunday, political people trying to help, I'm going to take a kinder view of that. And the best way to describe it is to describe a really terrific guy I met and I've known for a long time. His name is Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General of Alabama. I work with attorneys general. He and his wife came to visit me in my home in Lisbon Falls. Could not be nicer. Very conservative. I'm a liberal guy. But Jeff is probably one of the easiest people you'll ever know and like. Genuinely good person. The kind of person who would help you out. So he ends up becoming the Attorney General of the United States during the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And he comes and he has a little private talk. Attorneys General have a little club. And I'm in the club, even though I'm not Attorney General. So we're having a little private. If it was totally off the record, I wouldn't tell the story, but it was kind of mixed. Sort of like, So Jeff gets up. By the way, Jeff Sessions named after Jefferson Davis. And his middle name is Beauregard, named after the Confederate general who shelled Fort Sumter. Okay, so you get a glimpse a little bit about Jeff's family background. So Jeff says to us, he's exactly my age, a couple months older. He said, I loved growing up in Alabama. He said, we could leave our keys in the car, the doors were unlocked, there was no crime. It was wonderful. And I was sitting next to Peter Harvey, who was at that point, former Attorney General of New Jersey, the first black Attorney General from New Jersey. He'd gone to Columbia Law School, but he was brought up in Alabama. He leans over and he says, Jim, I don't quite remember it that way. All right, I don't quite remember it. Because he remembers that when Jeff Sessions was going to the senior prom, was the same year that 4 little girls were blown up in the church in Birmingham, not that far from where he lived. Where Martin Luther King wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail. Where the Edmund Pettus Bridge and Selma marches occurred probably while he was gone to the junior prom. And Jeff's the kind of guy who'd be back, if he said he had his date back by 11, he'd have his date back by 11. This is a very nice, decent person. But clearly, completely unaware of his own existence. And here he was, Attorney General of the United States, charged to enforce the Voting Rights Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Civil Rights Act. It was his job to do that. And yet, on a personal level, just a very nice, decent guy. So I like to think that's where the Supreme Court is. I think that, we had a Maine humorist, a guy named Tim Sample. He used to talk about his nephew who don't know nothing. It's not that he don't know nothing. It's that he don't suspect nothing. And I get the sense that these justices on the Supreme Court, you can feel the rage from Justice Sotomayor, for example. Just the fury, the unshaken fury of this Latina woman who was discriminated against from the moment that she stepped on the Princeton campus. Not allowed in certain clubs. Justice Alito was at Princeton too. He didn't want any women in these clubs. And listen, this court has done all these things, but they're also, they seem to just completely lose their mind and get very silly. They seem to have an obsession on who gets into Harvard. Who cares? Who cares who gets to Harvard? There's a big lawsuit and cases and First Circuit appeal 5-4 and I mean, why? I really don't understand their priorities. If you're a Supreme Court judge and you're worried about young people and their education, then spend a little more time on student debt. And if you don't like what President Biden is doing, and there are some things I don't like about it, don't try to be a legislator. Give some guidance in your decisions as to how to fix it. So, my God's sakes, people who are dying under debt load can come out and live a life. No, we're obsessed with, I don't know who's going to get into Harvard next year. We can't use race. That might knock one of those prep school tennis players out, Well, if they don't go to Harvard, they can go play for Williams, right? I mean, I don't care. It's my look, I'm a public school guy, just so you know. I'm a Brunswick High School, University of Maine, Orono, this school. I taught school for a couple years, junior high school. I taught here for a little bit. And among my students were future Attorney General Mike Carpenter and our current Chief Justice, Valerie Stanfield, was a student of mine here. When I was teaching, while I was AG, I would come down and teach as an adjunct. So I'm a public school guy. I believe in this. I believe that we can do these things. So, what do we do? That's the question for you. What do you do now? I've got lots of questions. But now let me give you one little example. I have a few minutes. Look at the time. Just a few minutes. I was a backbencher in the Maine legislature. I was so ADD, I didn't do so great here in law school. I mean, I had to do something, so I got elected to the legislature. 5 of us did in our class. So I'm a backbencher. I'm not in leadership at that point. And we had this problem, a constitutional issue, as to how we were going to confirm all of our judges, but also confirm every cabinet member. There's a fight between the House and the Senate. Who was going to confirm? I was appointed to a committee of 3. And with me were 2 Orono classmates. One was Mike Carpenter, who became Attorney General. The other was Olympia Snow, who went on to be a Congresswoman in the United States Senate. 3 of us. The Senate had a committee. It was great. The House had all gone to the University of Maine. The Senate had all gone to Bowdoin. Right? It was like perfect, right? So, but anyway, the Senate chair was a state senator named Robert Clifford, who went on to become Supreme Court Justice in the state of Maine, former mayor of Lewiston, dear friend of your deeds. And it took us about an hour, and we solved it. We ran it by leadership. They loved it. 2/3 of both houses of the legislature voted for it. It went out to the voters of Maine. It passed by a 2-to-1 vote margin, 1975. And nobody knows we did it. And that's the way it's supposed to be. It works. And never once did I check with the common law or, what were the founders of the Maine Constitution in 1818? What did they think about? No! We had a problem, and we solved it. And the fact that nobody knows it is just wonderful. It is just wonderful. It just worked. So I saw Olympia at my law school reunion the other day. We laughed about it. Married to a classmate. And so these things can happen. You can do it. And you do not have to be a member of the Maine legislature. Many of you aren't from Maine. I'm not urging you to go run for office. Frankly, I get that question a lot from students, and I'm saying, I'm not sure that's the place where you want to be today. It's a difficult deal. But that doesn't mean you can't make the world better. If you don't want to make the world better, why are you in law school? Why are you here? You want to make money, go into finance, go sell real estate, Go sell cars. A better chance of making money than coming here and picking up a debt and trying to figure it out. You're here because something inside you calls you to the rule of law. That we as a society can govern ourselves in a principled and legally based manner. And that you can be part of that. You can be part of that. So here's my Polonius-like advice. Look, you handle a case when you're out of here. Maybe you're doing criminal defense, maybe you're prosecuting. After the case is over, your job isn't done. Your job is to find out what happened to that person, why was this, what happened, what led to these series of events. If you're representing a developer who wants to build something, good for you. And after it's over, or a bank, after it's over, the case isn't over, you step back and say, okay, we succeeded, but what does this mean for affordable housing in my community? What does this mean for homeless in my community? This isn't partisan. No Republican and no Democrat wants to see people sleeping on the street. You can do this. It's just how you get to it. So you come out, you get out and say, well, I guess I better check the zoning laws and the building inspectors, and right? You don't simply trash the administrative state. I mean, I had a granddaughter who goes to USM, and she was on her way to class, and she made a mistake, and she rear-ended somebody. Typical Maine slushy day, right? Guess what happened? The airbag went off. She went out of the class. She went to the dance class. Right? She didn't know that airbags were the result of a long, involved process with the car dealer. Car manufacturers fought back and forth in Congress, and federal regulations and appropriate hearings and what's going to be in the airbag. She doesn't know that. She just knows she's fine. It works. And those 6 originalist Supreme Court justices who are hell-bent to destroy the administrative state, guess what? Their cars have airbags too. And the gas in the car, if it's not electric, if the gas in the car is not leaded. That was a fight too. And that the air that they're breathing is cleaner because of the administrative state. And that's why I come back to Jeff Sessions. It's like, it's not that they don't know nothing, it's that they don't suspect it. They don't understand that you don't govern 333 million people with any sense of justice unless you do this together. And that's our Constitution. That's our real Constitution. It isn't that document. Maybe those 6 people were wrong when they sat down, right? Maybe they shouldn't have written the document. Maybe they should have said, let's stick with the common law. Let's follow our mother country, England, and see if there's a way that we can do this without writing it down. But they wrote it down without any idea that these 6 people, most of whom will be on the Supreme Court long after I'm gone. I'm 77 years old. I've had my run. Right? This is up to you. This is up to you. You are here heavily subsidized by people who are out there working hard today. I mean, I know you've got a debt, and you go, oh God, it's really expensive, which is true. A lot more expensive than it was when I was here. But you're still being subsidized. You owe those people something. The people standing out there as a barista, the people who are working at Bath Iron Works, the people who are driving the snowplow this winter, driving the school bus to get kids to school, they're paying their taxes. They're subsidizing you, the privilege that you have, the privilege that I had, the privilege that Dean Softly had, to be a lawyer. So it's your board. Good luck. Thanks for having me.